Streaming is almost ready. There. All right. That is working the way it's supposed to. At least I think so. You can never tell sometimes. Oh, no, no. See, I said it was working, but it was not accepting the chats. So I need to fix that. That is to say, not accepting chats on YouTube. So click there and click there. All right. Now I think it's doing what it's supposed to do. Okay. Yes. Technology making things possible, adding a layer of complexity. All right. Well, it is after 12 o'clock, 12:01 to be precise. So let's go ahead and get down to our study. We're actually going to begin just here at the end of chapter 49 and then into chapter 50 as we explore the very end of this section of Torah, a portion known as Vayechi. And this is the end of the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, as we bring everything that began with creation, which we started talking about all the way back just after Simchat Torah, to its conclusion, and then it becomes prelude. As the old joke goes, the past is prelude. Thus, we need to know it to understand the present. Well, to understand the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, which is about to begin, we need to understand the book of Bereshit. And in particular, we need to understand the cycle that has led to Abraham, and then from Abraham through to Joseph and his family down in Egypt. But we're not going to be talking about the big picture today. We're not going to be looking at the meta view of history and all of that. I've talked about that in some other classes as well as sermons. But right now I want to look down on what this can teach us about the particulars, indeed the particulars of the family, as we're going to see here as we start off with chapter 49, verse 33. When Jacob finished his instructions to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, and breathing his last, he was gathered to his kin. So this phrase at the end, Vayasef el amav, is a trope that is repeatedly, it's redundant, a trope that is repeatedly often throughout the text of Bereshit and throughout the text of Tanakh. It is reminding us that there are real people here, there are real families here, and that the passage of one moves them from being among the current to among the ancestors, among their people, literally. And of course, it is the becoming of an Am, the becoming of a nation, that this whole cycle of Jacob and Joseph have been so important for. But it is not just as a nation, because as we see immediately in verse 1 of chapter 50, Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Immediately, we see the human cry, the human heartbreak, that Joseph is not just the new leader of the family clan down in Egypt. Joseph is a son who has just lost his father. And although their reunion was much delayed, we knew from the first that Joseph was very concerned about whether Jacob was still alive. And he is now devastated when his father has finally passed away, although obviously relieved that they could be together for those remaining years of his life. And Joseph is weeping over him, as I've pointed out many times. Weeping is a perfectly normal behavior throughout Judaism for both men and women. It is terrible that I even have to point that out, but unfortunately, there are some in the modern culture that seem to have a different view. Likewise, the expression of affection and devotion through kissing is also a prevalent custom. But when someone dies, it is not just the tears that matter. There are practical matters to attend to. Then Joseph ordered the physicians in his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. Again, Israel is the other name for Jacob. And we can ask, well, why embalm? Is this a normal procedure in Jewish burial? And the answer, of course, is no. Even to this day, embalming is avoided at all costs when it comes to preparing somebody for their burial. However, there are some extenuating circumstances, and the most important is that the body is going to be transported. So immediately upon reading verse 2, we can know that Joseph is indeed getting ready to prepare the wishes of his father, that he will be buried back in the land of Canaan, in Machpelah, in the city of Hebron, in that burial chamber that was prepared by Abraham all the way back when Sarah first passed. So the embalming here is a necessary component for transporting Jacob to his final rest. But it is not something that is done under other circumstances. Sorry, I should point out that in the modern world, yes, that is also still true. If somebody is traveling and they pass away, and it is necessary to embalm them in order to transport them back to wherever they will be buried, or if they pass away here and they wish to be buried in Israel, the land of Israel, then they can also be prepared for such travels as is necessary, depending upon those circumstances. While we do not delay a burial for the convenience of the family or for any other trivial reason, we can delay a burial for the honor of the deceased, and certainly being buried in a place of honor, most notably here, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, is a perfectly appropriate reason to delay such burial. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days. So we know that Egypt was famous for their funerary practices, and here we see it being put to good use. And when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, "Do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave, which I made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return." All right, so again, we're not going to dwell too much on the politics of all of this. We've talked about this in other classes, but just have to always mention it when we come past this portion. We recognize that Joseph may be second in all of Egypt, but that doesn't mean that he is truly free. This is not like a modern political appointee or position in the United States where you can just resign and go become a private citizen at your own leisure. Joseph is at the beck and call of Pharaoh. And while it is true that he has great power, Pharaoh can still override Joseph whenever he feels like it. And in some ways, this is actually a sort of foretaste of the slavery that will come. In some ways, this is a continuation of the slavery that Joseph had under Potiphar. It's just a much higher position and a much better job. But Joseph needs permission to leave. You can't, in the Egyptian world, have such a high-ranking person just wander out of the country doing who knows what without Pharaoh's permission. And Joseph has to go through the proper protocol to make that request. Thankfully, verse 6, and Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you promise an oath." We see that he does allow this, although the oath apparently was rather important. It is, of course, would have been possible for Jacob to have been buried without Joseph, to have sent him with the other sons, but clearly Joseph wanted to fulfill this mitzvah himself. Verse 7. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, and all of Egypt's dignitaries, together with all of Joseph's household, his brother and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the region of Goshen. So we see the large entourage that goes up, that is giving great honor to Jacob, and by extension, giving great honor to Joseph, who does still wield considerable power in the land. We do also see, again, a foretaste at the end here of verse 8, that when Joseph goes up to bury Jacob, that the children, their flocks, and their herds remain in Goshen. Well, as we know later on in the book of Shemot, when Moses is arguing with Pharaoh, Pharaoh does suggest that the people leave without the children, the flocks, and their herds in order to worship God in the wilderness and then return. Clearly, that Pharaoh is drawing off the experience of this Pharaoh, where indeed, it is possible for the adult members of the household to go and to leave others as well as their property behind. Obviously, that wasn't the intent to set a precedent here, but nonetheless, it does seem to have become one by the time of the enslavement. Verse 9, chariots too and horsemen went up with him. It was a very large troop. When they came to Goren Ha'atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held there a great and solemn lamentation, and he observed a mourning period of 7 days for his father. So this word lamentation is rather important. This misped gadol. This is from the word that in modern usage you might have heard called hesped. It is a eulogy. Lamentation has a particular connotation in English, which is different than the word eulogy. Although eulogies are clearly meant to be laments as we mourn the loss of the person, they are also meant to be statements of praise for the deceased, something that the English word lamentation I don't think quite captures. So eulogy too, on the other hand, also is a bit clunky in the English. That's why we have to sometimes stop and discuss these things. And you will notice that he observes then a mourning period of 7 days for his father. Now you may be thinking, but didn't we have 40 days of embalming and didn't we have 70 days of Egypt wailing? Why is the mourning period happening now? And yes, this may feel like the familiar Shiva, the familiar 7 days of mourning, but this seems to be in an odd position. And indeed, as we'll come back and talk about this in more detail, it is. And oftentimes those odd positioning and odd phrasing are precisely there to gain our attention, to help us understand more details than we might have otherwise had it been a smoother read. And when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at Goren Ha'atad, they said, "This is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians." That is why it was named Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had instructed them. And then he gets moved on. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, near the field of Mamre, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. And after this all happens, they go back to Egypt and we get some more family drama. But that's not the focus for today. Now, you'll notice that verse 13 or 12 and 13 can be interpreted as being a sort of summary of the entire episode. It actually feels as though the details of 10 and 11 are a little bit of a interruption. This is normal in the Tanakh detail, which is to give a larger view, but to often interrupt or intersperse it with additional details, sometimes out of sequence. Indeed, many commentators argue that verses 10 and 11 actually come after the burial at Machpelah, that it comes after the entombment of Jacob, rather than here, where if we were reading this in a strictly linear, that's the right word, a simple linear chronology would seem to have been done before they even buried him, which, as we'll talk about, would be most unusual. So hold that in mind as we come back to this discussion of the 7-day period of mourning when we get into our commentary. But before we do that, are there any questions from these verses of chapter 50? Or the very end of 49, to be technical. Let me just double check if the live stream has caught up. Looks like it's doing fine.
This is Greg. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, Greg. Fire away.
Great. The one thing that did strike me was I thought it was kind of interesting that that the number 7 comes up, and I think I was reading in the Eitz Chaim that it said its origin was different than from Bereshit. I think they made reference to Gilgamesh. Oh yeah, right here on page 308. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. It's like, I guess I'm a numbers guy, and while the number 7 is significant to me after all these years of religious training, I can't help but think, well, um, what if some other culture decided to chop up the year in some other ways, right?
Right. And what we have found historically is that the number of seven for a week-long activity is relatively universal. It's not 100%, but most cultures have also come up with seven as their weekly cycle. And this works out very naturally when you realize that most ancient cultures were lunar based when they were coming up with their original weekly cycle. And it turns out that 4 weeks of seven is a very natural way to divide up the moon cycle, where it goes from nothing to half to full to half gone to nothing again. The moon has a very natural 4-part cycle, and it does map very nicely on 7 days. And with a little adjustment for leap years and such, that cycle works pretty well for keeping track of the whole annual calendar as well. Which is how you end up with, the 12 months of the year. So that's not something that is inherently a gifted revelation. That's something that is built into the fabric of creation itself by just the way the moon orbits our planet. But it is important to recognize then that not every seven is a reference to creation. Sometimes the seven has other meanings. And indeed, we could even argue that the 7 days of creation were taken because seven itself was more important. After all, God was not limited to a standard week. God could have done what he wanted to do in 1 day, or he could have done it in 10 days, or he could have represented it in any other form. And throughout our tradition, seven does seem to have a place of privilege as being a number which shows earthly completion and fullness in most ways. So great reference.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing anyone else in the chat, so let's go ahead and pop into our commentary and see what they have to say about this. And what I wanted to focus on was actually some of the very practical implications that come from this and other passages that apply to us even today. I know that feels weird because many of us are, very contemporary 21st century type of humans. But much of what we are doing is still derived either directly from the Torah or strongly informed by it through rabbinic tradition. And much of what we do would be immediately understandable and recognizable to Joseph and his family. So let's begin here. I'm taking heavily from Sefer HaChinuch, one of my favorite compilations on Jewish law, as it does not only follow the different sections of the Torah very nicely, but it also gives a little extra commentary to help us feel the meaning of the rules rather than just lay them out straight. Rambam, may his best memory be blessed, wrote, and this itself is the commandment of mourning, meaning to say that each person in Israel, meaning the Jewish people, is obligated to mourn for his relatives, meaning the 6 relatives mentioned in Scripture. So this is talking about the passages in Vayikra that talk about the mourning of a Kohen for their relatives. And there we see it outlined that everybody will mourn for their parents, for a sibling or a spouse, or for their children. And that creates the circle of 6, if you will, that are our relatives for whom we are obligated to mourn. As always, a person is allowed to feel sad, devastated, and to express that when someone dies that they are not obligated to mourn for. But when somebody passes for whom we are obligated to mourn, then the additional rules and stringencies kick in. And the verse that the rabbi brought as a source for the commandment of mourning is that which is stated by Aaron. If I had eaten the sin offering today, would it have been good in the eyes of the Lord? And he said, and for the strengthening of this commandment, they elucidate about the priest that he is warned about impurity, that he should become impure regardless, like the other Israelites, in order that the laws of mourning not be weakened. Important to recognize that in the ancient world, when somebody passed away, the family was intimately involved in preparing that person for burial. And that meant coming into contact, at the very least, within the same space, if not actually physically in contact with the preparation of the body. That creates a highest level of ritual impurity, which a Kohen, a priest, would normally be prohibited from encountering. However, because mourning is so important, the Torah chose to exemplify its importance by reminding us that even a priest is required, not given permission, but required to render themselves ritually impure when taking care of their immediate relatives. And so too, if we can recognize that for the rest of us, that taking care of our relatives and engaging in the mourning practices is of utmost importance. This is not a casual, optional, or recommended behavior. This is considered a very high level of obligation to each and every one of us. And by doing so, as he points out, the laws of mourning will not become weakened. It was already elucidated that the mourning of the first day is by Torah writ, and that it is the day of death and burial. So there's a lot of discussion about the process of Shiva, that is to say, the week-long mourning rite, and whether or not the entire week is a set-aside time, as commanded by Torah, meaning that there is no option whatsoever, or whether or not only part of it is set aside by the Torah. Here, Rambam, as quoted by Sefer HaChinuch, which is taken from the Talmud, explains that, in fact, the Torah itself has only commanded one day of absolute mourning. That is the first day of the burial, and that is the day of Shiva, if you'll pardon the expression, since it is only one day. And the additional days of mourning are of rabbinic institution, as we'll see. And they said in the elucidation in Moed Katan, that's in the Talmud, that it is not practiced on the holiday, meaning if somebody is to be buried on a day of Yom Tov, a day of celebration, Pesach, Sukkot, etc., that we don't do the acts of mourning. We delay them until after the holiday. Why? The positive commandment of the many comes and pushes off the positive commandment of the individual. Now, I know this is a very hard thing to understand, being good contemporary 21st century individualists, especially here in the United States, where individualism is often raised to a high level of religiosity. But the sages understood that the Torah was trying to teach us something very important, that while it might be that we are personally devastated by the loss of our loved one, our personal loss will require community involvement, because the community has to be there to support us. And the community need of the holiday means that they are not in a position to be able to do that. And that communal obligation, that is to say, the mitzvah that applies to everyone, supersedes then the mitzvah of mourning that applies to only one individual. As such, we delay those mourning practices until the holiday has concluded. And behold, it is elucidated from this that the obligation of mourning is from Torah writ, and that it is a positive commandment, but only on the first day. And the remaining 6 days are rabbinic. So we often differentiate between deoraita, mitzvot that are clearly enunciated in the Torah, and derabanan, mitzvot that are clearly expanded upon and clarified or buffered by rabbinic decree. Any questions then on our first paragraph here of these mitzvot? Okay. Since people are physical beings, they are not impacted by something in potential. Like I said, one of the things I love about Sefer HaChinuch is the fact that he will take this to a different spiritual level. So he is pointing out a general true idea that is found throughout Judaism, that yes, we care about our soul, we are ensouled creatures, wonderful, amazing, but our soul is found inside this physical body, this material self. And that's not bad, that's not terrible, but it does create certain, necessities. one of which is, if it doesn't really happen physically, we're not usually affected by it. Something that's just in potential doesn't usually make the impact on us that we might want. Instead, because we are physical beings, it doesn't become impacted on us until they take matters from the potential to the actual. And here what he means is we go from thinking about something to doing something. Hence, when the death of one of his relatives, about which it is natural for him to love them, comes to him, the Torah obligates him to do acts with himself that arouse him to focus his thoughts on the anguish that has come to him. Very different than many other pop psychology recommendations. Judaism doesn't say take your mind off it. And in fact, it says move your body such that your mind cannot be distracted from it, so that your internal state of turmoil and grief will be realized in physical actions which give a vehicle which will allow your grief to reach its full expression. And that is the healthiest and most appropriate way to mourn. Being stoic and shutting down and turning away from grief is not a Jewish response at all. We recognize that we are physical beings, and that if we just say, oh, I'll carry my grief in my heart, that is not actually going to work, because nothing it really affects us that doesn't become manifest in the world. And sometimes we have to take steps to create the right circumstances, the right physical setting, in order to allow that internal state, that spiritual place to fully manifest, to be fully impactful in ourselves and in the world. And in mourning, we see this most acutely. We go through all the various steps of limitations, of Shiva staying home, of sitting on the floor, of not anointing or bathing ourselves, if not caring for our appearances by trimming beards and hair, and all of those things by refraining from acts of intimacy with our spouse. All of those things are designed to create a physical reality where grief can live. Because that grief, that anguish is meant to be focused upon in order that we can properly experience it, that we can properly feel it. And that will, of course, create the right ground, soil, plot, take your metaphor as you wish, for the ultimate healing to grow, and the transformation of the pain of loss into a greater garden of memories, which can be tended to and visited without additional suffering in all of our remaining years, where we can partake of the memories of our loved one without it being shadowed perpetually in gloom and darkness. So let's talk a little bit more about some of those physical actions. Even though it is stated in our verse here in Genesis 50, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days, when the Torah was given, the law was recreated. Very important principle, that although there are many different places in the book of Genesis where certain mitzvot are mentioned or alluded to, it took the actual giving of the Torah out Mount Sinai through the vehicle of Moses, with the acceptance of the nation, for it to actually become binding, eternal Torah law. Let me rephrase that again, because I know that can be confusing. Something might have been mentioned earlier in Torah as being given to Noah, to Abraham, or to Jacob. That does not mean that it was already established in perpetuity as a Torah law. It had to be ratified. There was a distinction between what was done before the Torah was given throughout the book of Genesis and through our patriarchs, and what was actually obligated once the Torah was given. Now, obviously, there was a great deal of overlap. The mitzvah of Brit Milah was given to Abraham, and it was reestablished, recreated in the language here for all time with the giving of the Torah. Likewise, the gid hanashe, the sciatic tissue that is removed from animals in order to make them kosher in commemoration of the struggle of Jacob, was given to Jacob and his family at that time, but it was not created as a permanent mitzvah in perpetuity until it was ratified by the actual giving of the Torah through the vehicle of Moses at Mount Sinai. Likewise here, although it says that Joseph gave a Shiva period of 7 days for his father, that had to be reestablished when the Torah was later given. And nonetheless, they, may their memory be blessed, meaning the sages of old, said that Moshe, our teacher, ordained 7 days of mourning and 7 days of wedding festivity. And they said, again back in the Talmud Moed Katan, that the obligation of mourning does not begin until the coffin cover is closed, meaning to say that the whole time that he is not buried, the mourner is not forbidden in anything from all of the things of mourning. So this is coming back to our question of, when did the mourning take place? Did it take place before they reached the cave of Machpelah, which is where it sits in the verse order in our chapter, or did it take place after the burial at Machpelah, and was merely interpolated in the middle of that passage because of Torah's own literary style? This is arguing quite strongly that it could not have been a Shiva period prior to the actual burial of the loved one. Now, we can also counter and say, well, maybe it wasn't a Shiva, even if it mirrored the 7 days. I find that a little bit harder to countenance, but that's certainly room for discussion. But it does remind us that the actual obligation of mourning does not happen until the burial. Now, why would that be from a practical matter? Well, because until the person has been buried, our obligation is entirely focused on their burial. And we cannot begin to truly explore our own grief and to allow ourselves to fall apart, as they say in the modern terms, although, again, falling apart has a negative connotation. We can't allow ourselves to simply let the grief consume us, to allow us to truly dwell on it until we have fulfilled that obligation. It would be selfish if we were to dissolve into grief while the needs of our loved one were still there before us. And as such, Shiva does not begin until the funeral has finished. Prior to that, the obligations of mourning, all of the other strictures that go along with mourning, are not observed. One of the ways that we see this in the modern world that I think will be familiar to almost all of the students is the recitation of Kaddish. If there was a delay in the funeral, for example, they were being transported to their grave in Israel or somewhere else that was distant, those that mourn would not be saying Kaddish in the intervening days in honor of their loved one. They would wait until the actual burial took place, and then they would recite Kaddish from that moment forward. This is one of the reasons why we do a Kaddish immediately at the graveside after the burial has concluded, as that is indeed the first moment when such a mourning rite can be observed. Questions or comments before we move into one of the case studies on this topic? All right, well, the most famous case study here is on the story of King David. And if you're not up on King David and Bathsheba, go back and study it with good commentary, as it is a very complicated and difficult story. And I think you'll be impressed by many of the subtleties of the tale. But one of the most heartbreaking points of this entire story is that in their dalliance together, King David and Bathsheba fathered a child. The child was born very ill, and the child then died. While the child was still alive, but suffering in illness, David was wailing and weeping and trying to do anything he could to see if the child might be spared such a harsh end. When that finished, meaning when the child died, David gets up and he takes a bath and he prepares himself, and that's what we're using as our understanding here. Because of this reason, that mourning does not begin until burial, King David bathed and anointed himself when his child died, before the child was buried, meaning that yes, he was able to do that additional bathing and anointing only because the funeral had not yet taken place. Once the funeral had taken place, then he would have been obligated to mourning, just like anyone else from that point forward. So he used that window of time between the child's passing and the child's burial to do the bathing and anointing. And that which they said in Shabbat 136a in the Talmud, that we do not mourn for any infant that has not been alive for 30 days, is because of doubt. But they, may their memory be blessed, said in the Gemara that if we clearly know that he has finished his months of gestation, his law is like the law of other dead people regarding mourning. And likewise, for all the other things, is his law like a complete person. So this often gets confused in modern retellings, as people sometimes don't consult with their rabbis. People will say, oh, well, you know, if the baby is less than 30 days old, we don't mourn for it if it dies. And the clearer way of saying that is, if a baby was born in a state of distress, that it was extremely premature and its viability was not yet established, and it passes, then indeed it can be considered as a form of miscarriage, and as such, mourning is not obligated. In the ancient world, that would have been a relatively common occurrence, unfortunately. And that meant that in order to spare families this repeated necessity of mourning for the infant, unless it had lived for at least 30 days, thus proving its viability, at least to a minimum degree, mourning was not obligated. However, that does not mean that mourning is forbidden. And indeed, if it is clear that the infant was born in its fullness of gestation, meaning that there was no chronological reason to suspect its viability, it was simply born and was now suffering from an illness. If the child dies even within those 30 days, we still have the obligation to mourn completely in the same respects as if the child was a full-grown adult. It is dependent upon the status of the infant, not just upon the passage of days. All right, let's keep going. And also from the laws of the commandment are the things that they, may their memory be blessed, said, again in the Talmud, that the mourner is forbidden with on the first day, from Torah writ, and the rest of the days rabbinically, meaning the things that we're about to list. Everybody agrees that on the first day, the Torah has told us we are not allowed to do these things. However, the rabbis also added the remainder of the week of Shiva, that they should not be done on those days as well. That is why, rabbinically, if there are certain additional extenuating circumstances, sometimes some permission can be given for the remainder of the week to do some of these activities. But on the first day, there is no wiggle room at all, no extenuating circumstances. It is categorical. So the law of 7 and 30 days, what we call Shiva and Shloshim, the law of 12 months of mourning for father and mother, the law of tearing, that is to say of Kriya, where we tear our garments when we hear that somebody has died, and we do that, who are the relatives you tear, and what is the time for it, meaning who is the one obligated to tear, and when do we do it, how it is for the other relatives, and how it is for the father and mother. Very famously, we tear over the left side for our parents, as that is the side of our heart, which was given life by them. We tear on the right side for all other relatives when we are in mourning. And for which of his relatives, and his teacher, and his greats, for which places in the land of Israel in the destruction. So there are other occasions for the tearing of our garments when we come into contact with some of the devastation of Israel. This, of course, being written in the Middle Ages, Israel was still in a state of perpetual devastation. Nowadays, indeed, this is a more complicated discussion. There are many people, such as myself, who believe that it would be lacking in proper gratitude to rend our clothes upon seeing Jerusalem, the foremost place of sighting for our tearing in the ancient world, because the modern city of Jerusalem is not in ruins. Yes, it is not completely restored in the sense that the Temple Mount has not been returned to our full control, and certainly the temple has not been built, but we are in an in-between stage. The city is absolutely under our control and may continue to be so. And the people who live there are flourishing and creating a great society. So to tear our clothes at the site of Jerusalem in the 21st century seems to be spitting in the face of the accomplishments that have been made over the last 100 years. So many people, like I said, myself included, do not tear upon seeing Jerusalem in her state of being rebuilt to her greatness. Let me lost my place. Sorry. And the laws of the tear that we darn immediately or after a time, and the law that a woman darns immediately so as not to be disgraced. The tear on our clothes, especially in the ancient world when people had only one or two sets of clothes, there were very strict rules of how that could be resewn and to what degree it could be resewn. It's not quite as relevant with modern clothing. If you need more information, let me know. And the law of the holidays that interrupt the count and do not count in the tally, and that which they said, that the decree of the 7 is negated to anyone who buries his dead even an hour before the holiday, and the decree of 30 is negated if 7 days passed before the holiday, and he began even 1 hour of the 30 days. And the status of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is the same as the holidays of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So let me just try and clarify that a little bit. He's doing a very brief summary. If somebody has begun their Shiva period, that is to say, they have buried their loved one, even if it was just an hour ago, and now the sun has gone down and Pesach, for example, or the other holidays listed has begun, then the period of mourning finishes, that Shiva period finishes with the onset of the holiday. The holiday essentially abrogates the remainder of that mourning period. Now, if mourning had not begun, meaning the person passes away during a holiday, then it is delayed, as we'll see, until after the holiday has concluded. But any of these holidays will terminate the period of Shiva. And if Shiva was also already concluded, then a second holiday would terminate the period of Shloshim, the remaining 30 days. And around the month of Tishrei, the month when Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret all happen in rapid succession, this can indeed happen to such a degree that both Shiva and Shloshim can be radically shortened due to the quickness with which one holiday overtakes the last. And finally, as I sort of mentioned in passing, that which they said, that even though there is no mourning on the intermediate days of the festival, a man tears for a dead relative for which he is obligated to mourn. So even though we do not begin mourning during the Chol HaMoed period of Pesach or Sukkot, we will still tear during that time period when we hear the news of their death, and then we will begin the actual burial and the actual mourning process after the holiday itself has concluded. Now, I know that sounds complicated, and it's complicated for good reason. Going all the way back to Sefer HaChinuch's earlier adage, we are physical creatures. And as physical creatures, we take the actual and turn it into reality through the physical world. And that holds for our celebrations. That is why we have a traditional week-long celebration of a wedding. Doesn't have to be as crazy as people make it look in some of the weddings these days, but celebrating for a week is an important way of translating the joyous love into a physical world so that the joyous love is also felt internally to its fullest extent. On the opposite side, when someone passes away, our bereaved love needs to be translated into reality through the physicality of mourning in order that our sense of love can be properly expressed internally and externally. But that then comes into a clash when we hit a holiday. When we hit a holiday, we also have an internal state that we are seeking to create of the sense of joy and gratitude to God for whatever holiday it might be. And we also have the grief that we are experiencing from a loss of a loved one. That means we need to have a system, a structure for figuring out which takes priority and in what form when these two are intersecting at different times. We are a single creature, but we can have complicated emotions, but they still need to be navigated. They need to be charted in order that we will express well exactly what we need to express about both our joy for a holiday as well as our grief at the loss of a loved one. And that is explaining to us very much what it is like to be human. It's not always easy to know which course to navigate. All right, let's go ahead and finish up with a little teaching here from Bereshit Rabbah, again going back to joy and sadness. And he observed mourning for his father 7 days. Why are 7 days observed? It is corresponding to the 7 days of the wedding feast. All right, so understand the Midrash here is trying to say we learned 7 days, not from grief and not from creation or some other point directly. We learned 7 days from the 7 days of wedding. And indeed, we saw a 7 days wedding when Jacob was getting married to Leah. So 7 days of the wedding are now being echoed in 7 days of mourning. Why? The Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, in this world you were sorrowful with this righteous one, and observed mourning for him for 7 days, meaning for Moses. In the future world, Olam Haba, the world to come, I will transform that mourning into rejoicing. As it is stated, I will transform their mourning into gladness, and I will console them and cheer them for their sorrow. From the book of Jeremiah. Just as I comfort you, so will I comfort Zion and all its ruins, like the matter that is stated, for the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her ruins. He will render its wilderness like Eden and its desert like a garden of the Lord. Gladness and joy will be found in it, thanksgiving and the sound of music. So this Midrash is trying to give us a sort of chiastic structure, if you will, meaning we come in and then we go back to the point we began. We come in from joy, from a wedding celebration. We then learn from that our mourning will last for 7 days as well. But even in that mourning, we will still hear the echo of the coming joy that will eventually arrive for the world. So by starting off with the theme of the wedding as the foundation of 7, it is giving us that glimmer of hope, even while we are mourning, that it will be eventually replaced by more rejoicing in the future. Here, of course, the ultimate rejoicing is held up as the what should give us the proper reflection for the sense of hope. That it's not that we're going to have another party; it's that eventually this world will be made perfect, and the lives of all will be made better. And especially given that for most of our history, deaths were not in a timely fashion. They were often cut short by illnesses that were easily preventable, by famine or by war and other things that were of human agency. Looking forward to Olam Haba, the world to come, where such death is only relegated to the history books, is indeed something for us to reflect upon, even as we grieve for the loss of a current loved one. And again, as you can see, it's this interplay between how do we do things that allows us to feel in certain directions, rather than keeping those feelings trapped within ourself. By giving them shape and remembering their shape at different times, we are better able to guide ourselves. All right, that is all the text we have. If we have any other questions or comments, I would love to hear them.
Rabbi, this is Greg.
Yes.
I'm getting, oh, here it is. Yes. So I read something interesting in the Chumash. Um, they made reference to the last words in it was just fascinating. They made reference to the last words in each of the five books of the Torah. Um, and just reading them, it really did seem like it was like a 5 word summary of the whole story. I thought that was uh pretty surprising and startling. So I wanted to share that. Where did I
Uh,
see that?
Absolutely. Actually, I was talking about this, not that particular quote, but I was talking about this theme on Friday night during my sermon, that oftentimes we drill down to, such a deep degree on any given verse or section of Torah that we sometimes lose sight of the overall plot, that we sometimes lose sight of the arcing connectedness of everything from beginning to end throughout the Torah. And so when we step back sometimes and we look at how things are played out in all of the five books, or indeed, as I was saying on Friday, throughout the entire Tanakh, we can see things that otherwise might get lost. That's the forest and tree metaphor is very appropriate.
Mhm. I did see that was I found it at the bottom of page 310, just to state that. And I remember then going to uh, the Book of Numbers to understand why. So apparently it ends with I said apparently it ends with the word Jericho, and I thought, well, why Jericho there? And it was interesting. At any rate, it totally worked. So
Absolutely. Great. Well, I will encourage everyone else to look that up as well, and maybe when we're in shul, we can talk about it in more depth.
thank you.
Great. Well, I don't think I'm seeing any other connection. All right, so I think we're going to wrap it up there. That's the problem. When we're in person, I can always just scan the room and check for the eyeballs. It doesn't work so well over the internet, but that's why we have technology for people to pipe up in any way. So I will wish everyone a good and happy Gregorian New Year. It's not a big deal in Judaism, but anytime you can think about things you might want to change or things you want to hope for, Judaism supports those kinds of ideas. So I'll see everybody in 2024, just around the corner. Take care and be well.
Thank you.